My name is Madeline Martin, and I am a professional integrated success coach within transformative learning at the University of Kentucky. Today, I want to start by asking you a question. How are your note-taking skills? If your answer was anything less than awesome, you may want to stick around and see what our note-taking model of choice could do for you. Now, I want to preface, we all take notes and learn information in our own unique ways. The model that we will be looking at is well-researched and an easy-to-navigate tool that should help you get started with some new ideas about how to approach note-taking in general. Before we get too far into things, we want you to know that you can always meet one-on-one with an integrated success coach to learn more about all of the note-taking models that we offer and potentially tailor one that may be specific to you. Now let's take a look at the Metacognitive Note-taking model. To get started, we'll look at the top of the page where you can see we have provided space for you to include the date of the lecture. This is so you can make sure your notes are in order when you sit down to study. Next, we have a space open for you to include the name of your class and the learning outcomes for that specific class that can be found on the syllabus. Now you may be wondering, why include that every time? Well, your learning outcomes remind you what the overall goal of your class is and can be helpful to reflect on when we start to think about how each lecture fits into those overall goals. To add a little science, this builds mental connections in your brain that are simple ways to increase retention of knowledge over longer periods of time. If we move down the page a little, you'll notice that this next section is set aside for making connections to the class content before class. If you have watched our coaching video around the study cycle, this could be done in your preview phase. The first block on the left-hand side is set aside for you to write down any background knowledge you have about this class or the specific lecture topic if you've already looked at the slides for that day. We want to ask ourselves, what do I already know about the topic of this class? Taking a minute to think about and write down your answers to this will allow you to assess your confidence before lecture, and it increases your ability to remember things long-term that you've already learned about that subject matter. The thought square to the right is where we want to take a second and briefly write down how you feel about the topic of your lecture. It may sound a little strange, but identifying what you are feeling before you step into the classroom can help us determine what your mindset is. For more information about maintaining a growth mindset rather than a fixed one, please refer to our growth mindset video. In the bottom left square, we have an opportunity to establish relationships and connections to the material you will be learning about that day. This is a good place to observe how this lecture may relate to material in another class you have taken or are currently taking. By establishing connections to previous lectures or topics, we can begin to strengthen what we may already know and give ourselves a reference guide later when we sit down to study and want to know where else to look for extra information about a topic. The last square on the first page is set aside for questions. It can be really helpful for us to identify what questions we have about a topic before we ever step into the classroom. This way, we can think about what areas to pay extra attention to and can look at it after class to see if the professor was able to answer our questions in lecture. If there are questions in this square that were not answered during your lecture, it may also give you a layout for what you want to address in the professor's next office hours. Moving down to the second page, we can see that this is the page where we take notes during our lectures. We've already put a good bit of effort into thinking about this lecture before it has begun, but now we're ready to absorb all the information the professor is about to give. You'll notice as we look at the layout of this page, we have a space for all the class notes on the right-hand side. If you've already asked your professor and confirmed that they will provide the PowerPoint slides for their lectures, then we may not need to worry about what they put on the slides as much as what they are saying for each slide. If this is the case, we can easily use numbers or slide titles to keep track of what notes correspond to what slides when we sit down later to review. The column to the left of the class notes section is what we set aside for learning insights. This is where you can write down questions, observations, thoughts or feelings about a particular topic, or anything of note that the professor has added. It can be helpful to develop your own system for learning insights that will help you keep track of what information seemed to be repeated a lot or considered important to remember. Keeping track of questions that come up in class can also help us remember what we need to ask the professor or our classmates about later to get more clarification. I had one student that loved to use this section to write down questions and keywords that reminded her what she thought about when she was in lecture, that were very funny opportunities for memorization later. For example, when she was in a psychology class and learned about Pavlov conditioning dogs, she had a moment where she imagined what the dogs would have said to Pavlov if they could have talked, and wrote that comment in quotes next to her notes. When she had to take an exam and had a question about Pavlov, so did that funny thought about the angry, drooling dogs, and she was able to remember that whole section of her notes. Needless to say, our brain has a unique way of remembering things, and sometimes we just need to take advantage of it. The last component of the metacognitive note-taking model is the area for summary at the bottom. This is a great place to simply write 2 to 3 sentences or bullet points that you felt were overall themes or key takeaways from that class. Some students will try to write these down before they pack up and leave. Others may do it first thing when they sit down to briefly review after class. Again, you'll notice that this model fits right into another stage of the study cycle. We hope that this model gives you an opportunity to think about taking notes in a more intentional way, and that this video is a guide for you to easily reflect on if you start to feel stuck with your current note-taking method. The overall goal is to take notes in a way that makes sense to you and give you a solid template for how to review when you sit down to study. Please reach out to an integrated success coach if you have any questions about this or any other concern that you may be facing. You can do this by emailing us at iscoach@uky.edu or making an appointment through MyUK. Thank you for watching.